Long before the word ninja became legend, there existed shadowy figures in the mountains and forests of Japan. They were hunters, monks, outcasts, and warriors who developed the earliest techniques of stealth and survival. These were the roots of the Shinobi. During the Heian period, from the year 794 to 1185, Japan was ruled by refined imperial court in Kyoto. The nobility focused on poetry, art, and spiritual rituals. But beyond the capital, in the rural provinces, lawlessness was growing. Bandits, rival clans, and rebel monks roamed the wild. In this unstable world, ordinary people had to defend themselves by unconventional means. They avoided direct conflict, hid in terrain, and moved unseen. These survival tactics, practiced by villagers, mountain ascetics known as yambushi, and rogue warriors, began to take shape as new form of practical warfare. They were not yet old shinobi, but the foundations were set. They learned to track without being tracked, strike without being seen, and survive without being caught. In the Kamakura period, from 1185 to 1333, the samurai class rose to power under the first military government. As warfare became more structured and strategic, so too did the need for intelligence. Early records mention agents being used to gather information and spread confusion behind enemy lines. These were not official soldiers, but specialists in espionage and infiltration. It was during the Muromachi period from 1336 to 1573 that the Shinobi truly began to emerge as distinct force. Political instability and regional conflicts between powerful warlords created the perfect environment for specialized operatives. In remote regions like Iga and Koga, hidden within Japan's central mountains, entire families began to pass down secret techniques through generations. These were not just assassins. They were scouts, spies, couriers, and psychological warriors. It trained in blending with the crowd, navigating terrain, scaling walls, and escaping through traps. Villages developed organized networks with leaders, codes, and strict training. They called this knowledge ninjutsu, the art of endurance, deception, and survival. By the end of the Muromachi era, the Shinobi were no longer just myth-like shadows. They had become vital players in Japan's civil wars, working quietly beneath the surface of history. The Kamakura period marked a major turning point in Japanese history. Power shifted away from the imperial court and into the hands of a new military government known as a shogunate. For the first time, the warrior class held true authority over the country, and with this change came new styles of warfare, strategy, and intelligence. Under the rule of the Kamakura shogunate, samurai ideals flourished. The battlefield was no longer dominated by large armies alone. Intelligence became a valuable weapon. Lords needed information on enemy movements, internal betrayal, and weak points in enemy defenses, but traditional samurai did not spy. Espionage was considered dishonorable under the strict moral code of Bushido. Therefore, the task fell to another group, still unnamed and unrecognized by formal history. The early shinobi. Historical records from this period mention the use of messengers and irregular agents who gathered intelligence or disrupted enemy supply lines. These individuals operated under secrecy, moving through forests and mountains to deliver critical information. Many were local farmers, monks, and lower-class warriors who had no allegiance to the elite, but possessed exceptional skills in stealth, survival, and adaptability. In the rural provinces, small communities began to organize themselves for defense. Regions like Iga and Koga, with their dense forests, high valleys, and difficult terrain, became natural safe havens for groups living outside the samurai hierarchy. Their practical knowledge was refined into repeatable techniques. They learned how to move silently across forests, to read the land and weather, and to disguise themselves among travelers, merchants, or even temple workers. These were not assassins. They were observers, trackers, and messengers who could disappear into the landscape. These early shinobi did not wear special uniforms. They did not throw stars or vanish in clouds of smoke. Instead, they wore the clothes of ordinary people. Their strength lay in remaining unnoticed. They watched, listened, and delivered truth in silence. The Kamakura government relied more and more on these operatives. Though unspoken, their role began to form. A structure. Some agent passed their knowledge to their children. Others trained their villages in watching roads, predicting movements, and avoiding traps. The idea of secrecy as a system, not just tactic, began to take hold. By the end of the Kamakura period, Japan stood at the edge of greater chaos. Regional power struggles were building. The fragile order held by the shogunate was weakening. But deep in the mountains and hidden valleys, the foundations of the Shinobi had quietly taken root. New kind of warrior was growing. One who did not wear armor, who did not call attention to himself, but who understood that sometimes, to win war, one must become the shadow. The Muromachi period was a time of growing unrest and fractured authority in Japan. While the Ashikaga shogunate held theoretical control from Kyoto, real power began to fracture across the country. Regional warlords clashed for territory and influence, while banditry and rebellion grew common in the countryside. This instability created a perfect environment for a new kind of warrior to emerge from the shadows. In the remote mountain regions of Iga and Koga, a different way of life took shape, isolated from the central feudal powers and protected by difficult terrain. These communities developed independently. They became self-governed, village-based societies where knowledge and defense were shared responsibilities. Out of this unique structure grew the fully formed identity of the Shinobi. Unlike the samurai, who emphasized open combat, honor, and status, the Shinobi trained in secrecy, deception, and survival. Their art, known as ninjutsu, was passed down through families and clans, combining practical combat techniques with wilderness skills, psychological tactics, and subtle observation. Training involved navigating forests silently, climbing stone walls, memorizing enemy patterns, and creating false trails. Many of these techniques were disguised as farming tools, hunting knowledge, or even religious practice. Iga and Koga did not form centralized ninja academies. Instead, each village acted as its own training ground. Children learned stealth and patience from young age. Elders refined techniques generation after generation. Oral tradition, selective mentorship, and secret scrolls ensured that skills remained inside the community. These were not fantasy assassins, but real people adapting to chaos with discipline, intelligence, and silence. As Japan slid further into regional conflict, the services of the Shinobi became more valuable. Warlords began hiring Iga and Koga agents to perform missions that samurai could not or would not undertake. These included infiltration of enemy fortresses, observation of rival strategies, spreading false information, and recovering stolen documents. The Shinobi worked under the cover of darkness, dressed not in theatrical black, but in clothing that matched the environment. Grays, browns, and navy blues that allowed them to vanish into shadows or foliage. Some Shinobi became legendary. Others remained anonymous for life, as the success of their work depended on never being identified. Their tools were simple but effective: smoke, sound, misdirection, and terrain were their weapons, not brute strength. They learned when not to fight, when to disappear, and when silence had more power than speech. By the end of the Muromachi period, the Shinobi had become an essential but unofficial part of Japanese warfare. Iga and Koga were not just geographic regions. They were symbols of independence, resilience, and mastery of the unseen. As the country approached the chaos of the Sengoku era, the Shinobi stood ready. Not with banners and armies, but with footwork, shadows, and memory. The Sengoku period was a century of chaos. Civil war erupted across Japan as powerful warlords battled for dominance. The central government collapsed. Alliances broke and reformed. Entire provinces burned. In this age of endless conflict, the Shinobi stepped fully into the historical spotlight. For generations, the Shinobi had trained in silence among the forests and hills of Iga and Koga. But now, their skills were in high demand. Warlords needed information. It needed quiet hands and silent eyes. It needed those who could cross borders, enter castles, spread confusion, and leave without trace. And so the Shinobi emerged not as soldiers, but as specialists, not warriors of strength, but warriors of knowledge. The Iga and Koga clans became known for their discipline and reliability. They were not formal armies, but networks of families, students, and elders bound by trust and secrecy. Missions were signed not in open orders, but through coded messages, gestures, and old relationships. Their services were not advertised, but their reputation spread. One of the most famous Shinobi of this era was Hattori Hanzō. Born in Iga and trained in both martial and covert arts, Hanzō became the right hand of Tokugawa Ieyasu, rising warlord. When enemies betrayed the Tokugawa clan and sought to capture Ieyasu, it was Hanzō and his Shinobi who guided him safely across hostile lands. Hanzo's loyalty and skill became legend, and his name was forever tied to the image of the noble Shinobi. But many Shinobi remained nameless. They were messengers crossing war zones, fire starters sabotaging supply routes, observers hidden in festival crowds. Some disguised themselves as monks or merchants. Others became entertainers or workers to access enemy strongholds. They never announced who they were. Their success depended on being invisible. Shinobi techniques continued to evolve. They developed methods for climbing walls quietly, navigating terrain under moonlight, and communicating across long distances without words. They crafted decoys, misdirection tools, and escape tricks. Their clothing was not always black. Depending on the mission, they might dress as farmers, pilgrims, or even beggars. What they wore mattered less than how they moved. During this time, the Shinobi also faced great danger. Some rival lords considered them dishonorable and hunted them. Others sought to enslave their skills, forcing them into deadly missions. Some Shinobi resisted by vanishing entirely. Others made uneasy alliances for survival. Despite the risks, the Sengoku period marked the high point of Shinobi influence. Never before or after were they so active, so essential, or so respected among those who understood war. They were not mythical warriors with supernatural powers. They were ordinary men and women with extraordinary discipline, shaped by necessity and sharpened by conflict. As the battles raged on, the Shinobi remained in the shadows. But history remembers their presence, not because they shouted, but the Edo period marked a new era for Japan. After more than a century of civil war, the country was finally unified under the rule of Tokugawa Ieyasu. With the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate, peace returned to the land. The swords fell silent, and with them, the Shinobi began to fade into the shadows once more. Under Tokugawa rule, Japan became a tightly controlled society. Class structures were strictly enforced. Samurai were confined to bureaucratic and administrative roles. Travel between regions required permission. The country was closed off from most foreign influence, the skills that once made the Shinobi essential. Stealth, mobility, information gathering were now seen as dangerous or unnecessary. However, the Shinobi did not disappear. In some cases, they were absorbed into new roles. Former agents from Mega and Koga were quietly enlisted by the Tokugawa government to serve in policing and intelligence. These agents worked under disguise, monitoring internal threats, guarding key locations, and investigating forbidden movements or conspiracies. They blended into a crowd, becoming merchants, monks, artists, or street performers while carrying out quiet assignments. Shinobi villages such as those Iga retained their identity for time. Some clans continued to train in secret, preserving their techniques through oral tradition and coded documents. But without war to fuel their purpose, the art of ninjutsu became more symbolic than practical. Fewer missions were given, fewer families passed down the knowledge. The war of the shadows was no longer needed on the battlefield. During this period, the Shinobi also began to enter folklore. As their presence faded from active service, stories about them grew. In popular plays and literature, the Shinobi were reimagined as supernatural beings, able to vanish in smoke, walk on water, or speak with animals. The line between history and legend began to blur. Still, in the real world, traces of Shinobi influence remained. Some techniques were adapted into early law enforcement. Others were absorbed into martial arts or spiritual practice. Many Shinobi simply became farmers, teachers, or wanderers. Their old tools were stored away. Their names were forgotten, but their knowledge left echoes. By the mid-Edo period, only few true Shinobi traditions survived, protected by secretive families in remote areas. The need for them had passed, but the spirit of endurance and awareness they embodied lived on in other forms. Patience, observation, adaptability. These were no longer tools of war, but tools of life. As the centuries moved forward, Japan would transform again. The world would open. Technology would rise. Old systems would fall. And from the silence of history, the Shinobi would reemerge. Not in battlefields, but in imagination. From warriors of war, they became legends of the unseen. The Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century marked the end of Japan's feudal era. The samurai class was abolished. The shogunate dissolved. Japan opened its ports, adopted modern technology, and transformed into a centralized industrial nation. With this sweeping change, the world of the Shinobi quietly disappeared. For centuries, Shinobi had operated in the margins of history. Unseen but essential. But in this new age, there was no longer a place for shadow operatives. The missions were gone. The secrecy became unnecessary. The traditions faded. What remained were scattered teachings, forgotten scrolls, and the stories whispered by old families in hidden villages. As Japan modernized, interest in its mysterious past began to grow. Writers and artists started to revive tales of old warriors, temples, and lost clans. Shinobi became favorite subject, but not as they truly were. Instead, they became something larger. The real Shinobi had been practical, disciplined, and resourceful. The new ninja of stories became supernatural. In novels, plays, and later in film, Shinobi were portrayed as beings who could vanish into thin air, walk on water, and fight dozens at once. They were given magical weapons, mystical powers, and secret bloodlines. The more distance there was from the past, the more fantastic the image became. In the minds of the public, history blended with fantasy. By the 20th century, the image of the ninja had spread beyond Japan. Films introduced masked warriors in black suits moving through smoke and shadows. Comic books and cartoons made them heroes, villains, and everything in between. Martial arts schools claimed ancient lineages. Tourism brought curious visitors to Iga and Koga, eager to see where the ninja once lived. Though exaggerated, these portrayals kept the spirit of the shinobi alive. They inspired curiosity, imagination, and creativity. Children around the world dressed as ninja for festivals. Movies and games built entire worlds around their legends. Even modern technology embraced the concept. Stealth modes, invisible features, and secret codes often bear the ninja name. Meanwhile, researchers and historians quietly worked to separate fact from fiction. They searched old documents, re-examined folklore, and interviewed families who still held fragments of the past. They found that the truth was more human and more powerful in the myth. The shinobi had no superpowers. What they had was patience, discipline, adaptability, and silence. Today, the legacy of the shinobi lives on in two forms. One is in the world of fiction, where they leap from rooftops, summon smoke, and wield impossible skills. The other is in the study of history, where their real story teaches the value of resilience, awareness, and thinking without being seen. From mountain villages to the modern screen, the shinobi have never truly disappeared. They simply changed shape. They became what they always were. Figures in the mist, watching, waiting, and moving when no one else could.